I hope you understand what this means. If me, stand here now and do a rap about an 80s cartoon, then that would be, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, the whitest thing that ever happened. I hope I can remember it. Are you ready? T-U-R-T-L-E Power. T-U-R-T-L-E Power. T-U-R-T-L-E Power. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. T-U-R-T-L-E Power. T-U-R-T-L-E Power. T-U-R-T-L-E Power. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. On the half shell, they're the heroes fought. Well, in this day and age, who can ask for more? Falls a lot when you factor in the funding in relation to the fuss that now surrounds the economic situation. I do, it wasn't like this back in the old days. If you want to know if the film's old, one way is to check if Corey Feldman's turning up as a star guest, as is true in this case. Where was I? Ah, yes, Manhattan. Straight away, the skyline is one clue that this film's an old film. In fact, you can see too. The crime wave is high, with muggings mysterious. All police and detectives are furious, and you would be too, if you'd filled up your diaries with witnesses who cannot answer basic inquiries. It isn't their fault, though, if they can't really place any faces of thieves who don't leave any traces. There's a discrepancy, you've got to admit, between a robber in a mask and a lost young kid whose family abandoned him, which is sad, but now he's found a scary ninja for a surrogate dad who's all... The kids are going, Master, yes! And he's like, this is the family from now on. Well, the kids are going, that's the best we've heard from anyone in quite a long while who is looking after us the way a father's supposed to do. So let's be warriors, invisible and ninja-clad, oh so capable of disappearing into the shadows. So now, if you leave the back of it open and turn your back upon it for the briefest of moments, you'll find a gang of teenagers in menacing hoods have cleared your lorry out entirely of electrical goods. So everyone's afraid of this crime wave thing, but no one thinks to point the finger at their own offspring, so they panic, and then they call the cops, and that, I'm sad to say, is where the trail just stops, because they can't find the source of this lethally evil force. This is serious, so what we could do with is some young reporter for Fortune to screw with, whose personal interest in noises of crime in the nearby vicinity leads to bad timing and ends in a face-off that simply does not gel with anyone's impression of the actor Sam Rockwell. So they're fighting, it's the end of the line for her in-depth investigation into organised crime until a side glides right through the night, collides with the light, and the good guys decide they might stop hiding and guide all the crime guys to one side, dividing them from April by the whites of their eyes, till a siren cries through the New York skies, and they're lying on their sides with their hands tied. So April's been saved, but she doesn't know it was by a reptile with a projectile, and she gets to relax at home with a brew and a shower, because they display a certain power. All I've written. Yeah. I'm not a rapper. It comes difficult to me. So I could just switch it off. But I do happen to know all the words to the real song. Yeah? Right, our ex-reporter is hot on the trail, determined to put these crooks in jail. Well, she spied the bad guys and saw what happened, but before she knew it, she fell in a trap and got caught. Yeah, she was all alone, with no friends, no foe. Now, this was beyond her worst dreams, because she was cornered by some wayward teens. Headed by Shredder, they were anything but good. Misguided, unloved, they called them the Foot. They could terrorize and be the angry youth. They'd mug the people who needed proof. But then from out of the dark came an awesome sound, shouting cowabunga as they hit the ground. From the field of weeds, the heroes rescued the flower, because they possessed a power. Power. When you stand for what you believe in and find the strength to do what's right, and you're irreparably disfigured by toxic chemicals to the point where integrate into society or ever truly be loved. That's turtle power. Here is on the half shell. They're on a mission. When there's a battle, you got the enemy wishing that they'd stayed at home. Instead of fighting these ninja masters with moves like rage. They were once normal, but now they meet Splinter's the teacher, so they are the students. Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Donatello make up the team with one other fella, Raphael, not actually the leader of the group, transformed from the norm by the nuclear goop. Peter's the food that's sure to please. These ninjas are into pepperoni and cheese. Back to the story then, it's not hard to find. That's it, ninjas not just of the body, but of the mind. Those were the words that the master instructed. But a letter from Shredder had Splinter abducted, and that was the last straw. Spring into action, step on the foot, now they're gonna lose traction. Now this is for real, so you fight for justice. Your shell is hard, so you fight, shout, they can't dust us off like some old coffee table. Since you have been born, you have been willing and able to defeat the sneak, protect the weak, fight for rights and your freedom to speak. Now the villain is chilling, so you make a stand. Back to the wall, put your sword in your hand, and remember the words of your teacher, your master. Evil moves fast, but good moves faster than light, shining for your illumination. Good versus evil equals confrontation, so when you're in trouble, don't give in and go sour. Try to rely on your power. Power. This is really happening.
Power. Power.